just start off by saying I'm Cyrille Médard Chardon. I'm a researcher at the Luxembourg Institute of Socio-Economic Research in the Department of Urban Development and Mobility. And today we're going to imagine a immobile future, perhaps, or other futures. It doesn't have to be immobile. Before we really get started about imagining a future, I think we really need to start discussing, have some agreement perhaps on constraints for a real zero society, before then kind of being able to imagine what living in a zero carbon society would be like. Because if we have different constraints, it's going to be a bit hard to have matching imaginations or agreement regarding those imaginations. So I'll present for a short bit, and then we'll break into some discussions, and then get back together and kind of highlight some points, and then I'll present another short aspect regarding imaginaries, and then we'll have a good half-hour discussion there about future imaginaries, and then I'll close off by talking about some next steps. So we're transitioning, or preparing to do so. We don't quite know to what, just less carbon emissions. Regardless, it's insufficient carbon reductions that have taken place or been planned. I think we can agree to that. And we rightly question and worry whether enough action will be taken to prevent exceeding certain tipping points and causing runaway climate change. It's an understatement, I think, to say that this would have impacts on our freedom. However, if we manage to reduce carbon emissions to a manageable level through constraints of individual choices, there should be another concern around what kind of society we will have. And so decarbonization will reduce our freedom. How it does that is yet to be determined. In a society of carbon rationing, should neoliberal capitalism dictate who and where carbon can be emitted? Mann and Wainwright in their book, Climate Leviathan, describe that in such a society, these enviro-financial instruments are likely to be created to integrate and distribute carbon emissions and power across governance scales. So, so this future is going to be determined by perhaps those who are in power. If we don't kind of suggest or be active or activists about defining what future we'd like this decarbonated future to look like. But I guess the first step is to kind of imagine what alternative living and mobility futures could or should be like. So at this conference, we're focusing on mobility, which is in our current society an important quality of life aspect, but obviously also a significant factor in decreasing our existing, I think, and future quality of life. So due to social isolation, accidents, just urban living, or anyways, there's other reasons to say that it has increased our quality of life in other aspects. But the carbon emissions is a definite pressure that's pushing down on bad things in the future. So regardless, it's hard for many to imagine a desirable alternative society without their car, let alone a zero carbon one, and all the implications that would have. So in this workshop, we'll focus on this aspect of imagining and describing what a zero carbon and environmentally sustainable future could look like. So, but let's first start with trying to talk about, let's first start by discussing constraints. I've broken it up to a few sectors, and I'll quickly outline these. There's some emissions and perhaps some objections. I've tried to focus on some that are maybe less mentioned, and we'll flesh these out and fill them out in the activity in a few minutes. So as we're all aware, carbon emissions have impacts beyond temperature alone, increasing weather intensity. I think if you're in the region where I'm living now, in the Luxembourg region, we've had all sorts of crazy flooding, and we are seeing lots of fires, but we're not the only ones. But other aspects are going to be related to crop failures, natural vegetation dying off, which again might link to fires and all sorts of other unintended or unexpected secondary effects. Sea level rise, coastal erosion is well known, as well as the spread of disease and pests. which complicate further wildlife management, but also, health. And I think we've seen repeatedly in this conference talking about how transition to zero carbon would have been easier, 10, 20 years ago, where we could have done small changes every year. Now we're running into situations where we need to do big changes that are hard, and I don't think appetite for them has necessarily gotten much better. So, but yeah, the more we do now, the more time it gives us for the trickier bits. And we all agree that very bad things can happen if we go over 1.5 degrees, and even 1.5 degrees, we're not sure if there's going to be some tipping points that we will exceed, and that it might, beyond our control. Regardless, we have to recognize as well that adaptation, even if we go zero carbon tomorrow, adaptation will be necessary. We've already kind of followed a route where things will get hotter and less stable for a period of time. At the same time, this means that emergency is also becoming the new normal. And society-wise, this translates into kind of new forms of surveillance and discipline. You can imagine a government saying, we have this already with the COVID crisis, where new powers are coming into play to protect the public, but what's to say that other similar powers won't be used to protect the public from creating too many emissions? Again, so we have to kind of shape this narrative, or shape this governance to be what we want it to be. So on the left here is this figure that I'm sure we're all familiar with. And I've put a few lines here for some of the kind of important events where we hope that there be change. None yet. I'll add the COP25 line there. We'll see if that makes a difference. So even with carbon zero soon, we're not going to see a reduction of temperature back to normal in our lifespans. It's pretty clear that the existing system, our society, is looking at tech or more research, or even just a continuation of existing societal practices of travel and consumption. So, it's not looking like we're making progress yet. So perhaps action will happen, if any. It's likely to be taken using economic tools, such as making carbon emissions very expensive, rather than through egalitarian means, such as giving each citizen a carbon budget. But who's going to make these decisions? Well, governments. And like I said, if COVID crisis has shown us anything, it's that such initiatives might be contracted out to companies. Again, we come to the question of, whose interests are we following? So what's also worrying is the potential future behavior of corporations and governments that do act, but in a less equitable fashion than we currently are. And at what point will we agree that we can't wait for technological innovation? So if something is like 10 years away, do we still strive for it? Or 5 years away, do we still strive for it? Because I think, the UK's carbon budget at this rate is gone in what, 4 years? Feel free to correct me. I'm not sure on that fact, but when do we start really discussing societal change? And there's very limited discussion on societal change. And so I briefly mentioned equity and justice, and I think, during this transition, I think we're well aware that certain demographics are already in a bad place, and they're vulnerable to the climate crisis and the climate change, whether it's local or other countries, or people living on atolls. But maybe in the UK, we're well aware of people who just can't afford to heat their houses. They're poorly insulated houses. And so, we need to try and, if we're doing a transition, we need to try and make it equitable by helping them more, giving them more assistance. And then from a justice perspective, we need to start planning when we do these imagining of future societies, how we can structurally organize it so that we kind of bring everyone to the same level rather than maintaining a system where it perpetuates this inequity. And that goes for a local and global approach. So mobility, again, we've hammered on this quite a bit. So I'll just kind of talk about some aspects that that I keep hearing that worry me. So yeah, mobility ties into most aspects of our lives, so we shouldn't really consider it independently. But we're going to need to address all spaces, not just urban. I think I've seen much more during this conference of talking about rural, which I think has it's been good for me. I haven't considered that as much as I should have, but we need to look at trip types beyond the simple commute, which doesn't actually, short commutes aren't really a factor, or they are a factor, just not a big factor in emissions. Yet we have a lot of focus on them. I think Greg Marston pointed this out when opening the conference, that just addressing the commuting congestion will have a small impact on carbon reductions. We need to really replace the longer trips with other purposes that generate a majority of the emissions. So I keep hearing about the electrification of vehicles, and there's some debate around, the embodied emissions, but we're still going to have to generate, even if it's a third of the energy. How are we going to replace an entire fleet of cars in time? We have 5 to 10 years to act, so we don't have the time. How do we generate all the solar panels or whatever method of energy you wanted to create in that time? And what's the embodied carbon of all that? I don't see it. I'm happy to have a discussion on this, but I feel like it's one of these systems where it allows people to kind of carry on business as usual. We don't have to change much. We just shift to electric cars. And so this is one of the things that I don't quite agree with. And so I'm happy to have a discussion about this. I'm not debating that they do have some local air quality benefits, but I just don't think it's enough of a change. So I see mobility constraints as being slower. We talk about carbon a lot, but I think we can also just talk about energy, because typically, even if we decarbonate, it's still going to go back upstream at some point to a carbon source, such as solar panels and building a new nuclear power plant or something like this. So the title of the talk is immobility, because I fundamentally think that we do have to decrease our mobility to some extent. Of course, we can replace some of that with active mobility, collective transport, diverse, multimodal mobility. Yeah, just kind of a consideration. If we look at it from an energy perspective, the HS2 project in the UK is supposed to travel at 330 kilometers an hour, and that's still going to require a huge amount of energy. And considering how speed and energy are related, you could use that same energy to power 4 trains going at 160 kilometers an hour instead of 1 train at 330 kilometers. So something to think about if we're talking about equity. Who's going to be able to afford that 1 train? And yeah. So a big problem, I think, in the UK. So I was living in a Hull for 5 years until not too long ago, and talking with the city, they couldn't quite fathom how they were going to resolve the housing problem in terms of heating. So there's definitely aspects of, our car culture creates sprawl just by having to spread out houses for wider roads, parking, etc. And obviously our housing is tied to mobility, but the poor insulation is a big problem. And like I mentioned, there's fuel poverty. That's a factor, going back to equity. But the city of Hull was having a real hard time trying to figure out how to actually how to resolve this problem. There isn't a clear economic solution to this, viable, certainly not. So, we are kind of constrained in the future to trying to really develop housing, and it might be less, separate houses. What's the term in the UK for, anyways, houses that don't share a wall. We have to move them closer to amenities, or move the amenities closer to the houses. That might mean repurposing certain houses to turn them into shops, stuff like this. We might have to do infill to increase the attractiveness and the feasibility of mass transport. And of course, we need to make these areas greener to reap some of the benefits of, water retention, heat reduction, so getting trees over houses that help cool them, stuff like this, and alternative materials. Also, where I was living, it seemed like increasingly housing was being built in areas that were vulnerable to flooding, because that's just the land that was available, which is crazy. So I think I think we're seeing that, so we're kind of jumping onto another side here of work and maybe labor and capitalism. And I think obviously they're highly related, but I think capitalism is running up against planetary limits, which are causing other problems besides carbon emissions alone, when we look at resource extraction and biodiversity and other aspects. But capitalism is always looking to expand its economic sector. And the way it does that is, instead of just sharing that drill or that bicycle to a friend, why don't you, get some money from it? We'll just take a small piece of the pie, and try to look for new ways of making money. And I think that in the future, we kind of have to try and push back at this aspect, because it creates all sorts of other secondary influences where we try and amass things or extract resources in order to amass. So of course, yes, there's going to be a lot of jobs in the green sector, or hopefully, but of course, there's other aspects more in the circular economy, upcycling. But there's a lot of talk of also decreasing work hours. 50, 60, 100 years ago, technology was seen as being able to decrease our work hours. But as a society, we kind of have been in a situation where, we're still working 40 or longer hour work weeks. But there's no reason why we can't shift some of that work out of the economic sector to unpaid work. And now that might seem like, what, unpaid work? But if you work 3 days a week, but then you help teach at the school, or help build a work for the city, for your municipality, working to build a cycle path, maybe that's something that's more social, has more personal value, better quality of life maybe. And maybe one repercussion of that is that there's less anyways, it's an economic cycle, so it's possible, but we have the system we have now. But I don't think that necessarily, if we could design a system, we would design it as what we have right now. So if we're going to design a future system, a future society, we can kind of question these aspects, what would make our lives better. The last section is leisure and lifestyle. So I mentioned this already, but I think we have to talk more about societal change. Certainly, we've heard people talking about, flights. That's obviously a huge aspect, but also fundamentally the consumption of goods. A lot of emissions figures don't look at, all the products we're getting from China or whatever other countries, and we consume, we create waste. And that's just not going to be feasible. So it's going to be very much trying to share things, maybe repair things, what I talked about. Change in diets is another big one we're not talking about. I know the consumption of meat just has emissions that are much too great. I sometimes joke that in the future, meat is going to be like a spice. You'll sprinkle on a bit of meat. I know some people find that horrifying, but when you look at the numbers, I don't see how meat consumption cannot be drastically reduced. And so there's this idea of private sufficiency versus public luxury. So if you can imagine, a simpler house, you don't need that garage, which you don't put your car in, but just all your stuff in, maybe get rid of it or turn it into some other kind of housing. So private sufficiency, but then we have a tool workshop in the neighborhood. We have a common gardening shed where we can get our lawnmowers and whatever else. And it's more social. And I know we've developed this kind of sometimes desire to not really see or spend time with neighbors, but I think, yeah, I'm not sure how to resolve that, or if that's just we fear what we don't know. So yeah, so some people see this as a lowering of living standards. I think social interaction would be an improvement, and contributing to this unpaid work would be so much more satisfying for a lot of people. Sometimes I wish I had, a job that was partially a little bit more physically, concretely productive, and I think other people might find that satisfying as well. So as I explained at the beginning of the presentation, the purpose of the workshop is to imagine and describe zero carbon futures. And so we're going to use those constraints to do that. So now I'll present to you a multitude of perspectives to stimulate ideas for aspects of imagined futures. While we're looking to decarbonate mobility in this conference, mobility is connected to everything else. So I invite you to take a broad approach, not strictly focusing on mobility. Perhaps many of you are familiar with Sean Doherty's book here, and I really enjoy that he takes an approach that's very grounded in individual everyday activities that we're all familiar with. And so I think that was a good first example of something that might be interesting to imagine, in a carbon-free or a zero carbon society. So whether it's looking at, how is your commute to work going to change? How is the school run going to change? Who's going to be doing that? As I think Lorna was mentioning, how's business trips? Are we all going to be telecommuting or not? Family trips, holidays, these will likely have to change as well. Another book that's been quite good, and there's been a lot of talk about some of the constraints as well in this book by Paul Chatterton, but he kind of imagines 4 big aspects of what would be needed for a carbon zero society, and he goes for car-free society with an expansion of the commons, so more public spaces, public sharing of goods, like I said, with the public garden or the repair workshop where people can kind of come and use the tools. Of course, a green city and a post-carbon city. But there's other perspectives similar to that where we could really focus these, which is the, how's that going to look in the urban? How's that going to look in the suburban, where they have other challenges of being mainly just residential areas, and then in the rural, and within all these aspects, it's going to be a very different solution and challenges. And moving on to a little bit more of the fiction side. So just to mix up some ideas, Bacigalupi has a nice book. It takes place in this world of rolling viral pandemics. We're not quite there yet, but well on our way. But he really brings back this aspect of animals as machines in urban society. I don't know how they compare to e-bikes and how their carbon emissions compare to others, but it's an interesting aspect. They also have these coil springs as a form of energy storage, where they tighten up these springs and then they can release the energy, kind of like a battery, but in other applications. On the right, here's a picture of actually an island that I visited in northern Germany, which is car-free, and they actually use horses to do all the deliveries for all the food, like there's shops, and also pick up all the garbage. Yeah, it's a very nice place. So another example of fiction here, in a world that hasn't quite acted fast enough. Perhaps this is more where we're headed. And I think in here, obviously, there's some flooding of buildings. So New York 2140 by Kim Stanley Robinson looks at how at the building level, you get these regroupment of communities working together. And so again, we got this blurring of work and unpaid work, where people are spending a lot of time working on maintaining their own little ecosystem with growing food on the roof and helping maintain the integrity of the building. But I also emphasize this aspect. I think that we're going to have to plan for adaptation anyways. Yeah. A more recent book. So this is fiction, but I think grounded a little bit more in reality, by Cosmin Poppin. And he really looks at the bicycle as a tool that can be used for maintaining the existing system, or as a system, or as a tool to challenge neoliberalism. So the bike really comes across as this, I think, symbol of like, it's a bicycle, everything it does is great. But when you look at Uber Eats or these bicycle delivery people running around, you can really see that it can be used as a tool to maintain exploitation and precarity for some people. The purpose of this workshop was to define what we've done in terms of constraints, and also start these discussions about imaginaries. But it's also to pave a way towards a short edited volume of an edited volume of short stories about carbon zero futures. So the template for something similar is this book by Graham Kitchen, Matter Turn, and Shaw about how to run a city like Amazon and Other Fables. And inside it, they describe they imagine a bunch of smart cities run by or like different corporations. And it's an enjoyable read. And anyways, but I was thinking that going back to the idea of trying to imagine our futures might be easier if there's something that's a bit more tangible, or that we can point to or describe to others, and then kind of backcast. And maybe that's going to motivate me to, head in the right direction. Because right now it's a little bit scary when people come up and say, we need to get rid of our cars. People legitimately freak out, I think, because we're not replacing them with, what's going to take that place, or how we're still going to get around. And so my goal is to do something similar with Imagine Zero Carbon Futures. And so what I want to do is I'm sharing a link. There's a Google form where it's just asking for your name and your email if you're interested, or you can email me at cyrille.mdc@liser.lu, and just express your interest. And we're going to get a working group of people who are happy to write or co-write these short stories. We're going to have some writing workshops, flesh out some ideas. I mean, I'm not a fiction writer, so this will be helpful. And yeah, just to really develop this resource for people, I think could be helpful. And that's what this workshop has been about. I want to thank you all for participating, for